Professor Harold Whitman had seen them all come and go. In his 15 years at Berklee College of Music, he'd watched hundreds of students walk through his advanced music theory classroom. Classical virtuosos, jazz prodigies, composition masters. All of them shared one fundamental skill that separated real musicians from street performers. They could read music. March 1969, Boston. The late afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of room 204, casting geometric shadows across the worn wooden floors. 50 students sat in their usual seats, notebooks open, pencils ready. Today's lesson, harmonic analysis of Bach's inventions. Professor Whitman, a thin man in his mid-50s with wire-rimmed glasses and a perpetually serious expression, stood at the blackboard, his chalk moving in precise strokes as he mapped out complex harmonic progressions. His gray suit was immaculate, his tie perfectly knotted. Everything about him suggested order, discipline, academic rigor. Music, he said without turning around, is a language, and like any language, it must be learned properly. Structure before improvisation, theory before expression, reading before playing. The students copied diligently. They'd heard this lecture many times before. Whitman had built his reputation on this philosophy. He'd studied at Juilliard, earned his doctorate from Harvard, published papers on European classical traditions. In his world, musical legitimacy came through formal training, through understanding the rules before attempting to break them. Rock and roll was not music. It was noise. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," Whitman called, setting down his chalk. The door opened and Dean Morrison entered, followed by a young black man with an enormous afro and clothes that seemed to have been assembled from different decades. Bell-bottom jeans, a silk shirt unbuttoned to mid-chest, a military jacket covered in pins and patches. He carried no books, no notebook, no briefcase, just a quiet presence that somehow filled the room. "Professor Whitman," Dean Morrison said with the careful tone of someone delivering potentially unwelcome news, "I'd like you to meet Jimi Hendrix. He's visiting our campus today, meeting with some of our contemporary music students." Whitman's expression didn't change, but several students in the back row straightened up. Even at Berklee, isolated from popular culture as the institution tried to be, Jimi Hendrix was not an unknown name. Our you experienced had been impossible to ignore. Purple Haze played on dormitory radios despite official discouragement. "Mr. Hendrix," Whitman nodded politely but coolly, "I'm familiar with your work." Jimmy nodded back, his hands clasped behind him. He said nothing. Dean Morrison sensed the tension. "I thought it might be interesting for the students to meet someone who approaches music from a different perspective." "Indeed," Whitman said, the word carrying more weight than its syllables suggested. He turned back to his students. "Class, we have a special guest today. Mr. Hendrix here represents what we might call the intuitive school of music, the approach that relies on feeling rather than knowledge." A few students shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned forward, curious. Whitman warmed to his theme. "Mr. Hendrix, I believe I'm correct in saying that you don't read music?" "No, sir," Jimmy replied quietly. "Never learned." "Fascinating." Whitman's tone was that of a scientist examining an interesting specimen. "And yet you've achieved considerable commercial success. Tell me, how does one compose without understanding harmonic structure? How does one arrange without grasping voice-leading principles?" Jimmy stood perfectly still, his expression unreadable. The room was quiet except for the distant sounds of other classes, other lessons, other students learning music the proper way. "I suppose," Jimmy said finally, "I just listen." Several students exchanged glances. Professor Whitman smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. "Just listen," he repeated, turning to write on the blackboard. "You see, students, this is exactly what I mean when I talk about the limitations of untrained intuition. Music theory exists for a reason. It's the accumulated wisdom of centuries of composers, the distilled knowledge of how harmony actually works." He drew a complex chord structure. This is a Neapolitan sixth chord resolving to a dominant seventh with a tritone substitution. Mr. Hendrix might hear this and think it sounds nice or interesting, but without understanding why it works, without grasping the underlying mathematical relationships, he's limited to happy accidents. The room was completely silent now. Jimmy hadn't moved, hadn't reacted, hadn't defended himself. Whitman was just getting started. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not dismissing popular music entirely, but let's be honest about what it is. Simple chord progressions, repetitive structures, basic harmonic movements that any first-year student could analyze in minutes. There's nothing wrong with entertainment, but we shouldn't confuse it with artistry. A student in the third row, Jenny Martinez, who'd been listening to Jimmy's albums in her dorm room, looked uncomfortable. She tried to analyze some of his songs for a harmony class and had been surprised by their complexity. The tragedy, Whitman continued, now fully engaged in his favorite subject, is that natural talent without proper training is ultimately wasted. Imagine if Mr. Hendrix had received formal education. Imagine what he might have accomplished with actual musical knowledge to guide his instincts. Dean Morrison checked his watch nervously. This was not going as he'd hoped. Jimmy finally spoke. Professor, you mind if I ask you something? Certainly. That piece you were working on when we came in. Bach? Whitman looked pleased. Finally, some engagement. Yes, the two-part invention in C major, Bach's pedagogical masterpiece. Perfect voice leading, mathematical precision, structural elegance. This is what real composition looks like. Jimmy nodded slowly. Beautiful piece. You know it. Heard it a few times. Whitman turned back to the blackboard. Of course, knowing it and understanding it are quite different things. The casual listener might appreciate its surface beauty, but the trained musician recognizes the deeper architecture, the way Bach manipulates motivic development, the sophisticated use of sequence and inversion. He was drawing diagrams now, showing the mathematical relationships between notes, the precise way Bach had constructed each phrase. His chalk moved confidently across the board, mapping out the genius of proper musical education. This, he said, tapping the board with satisfaction, is why we study theory. This is why we learn to read music, because this level of sophistication is simply impossible without formal training. The room was completely still. 50 students watched as their professor finished his demonstration, then turned back to face Jimmy with the confident smile of someone who had just proven an important point. Now then, Mr. Hendrix, do you see why I emphasize the importance of proper musical education? Jimmy was quiet for a long moment. Then he said very softly, You got a piano in here? There was an old upright piano in the corner, used occasionally for harmonic demonstrations. Whitman gestured toward it. Of course. Jimmy walked over to the piano bench and sat down. He flexed his fingers once, twice, then placed his hands on the keys, and he began to play Bach's two-part invention in C major. Not from sheet music. There was no music in front of him, not hesitantly, as someone might who'd heard it a few times and was trying to remember. Perfectly, every note exactly as Bach had written it, every voice clear and distinct, the left hand maintaining the steady bass line while the right hand danced through the melody, both parts weaving together with mathematical precision. But it wasn't just technically correct, it was musical. Jimmy played it with an understanding of phrasing that brought out the conversation between the two voices, the way they answered each other, challenged each other, ultimately resolved together. He played it like someone who heard not just the notes but the architecture beneath them. Professor Whitman stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, his confident smile vanishing. The students were transfixed. They'd been studying this piece for weeks, struggling with its technical demands, trying to understand its structure, and here was someone who supposedly couldn't read music, playing it from memory, with more musicality than most of them could manage with the sheet music right in front of them. Jimmy continued playing, his hands moving with casual fluency across the keyboard. He wasn't showing off. He wasn't playing louder or faster or adding unnecessary flourishes. He was simply playing Bach exactly as Bach had written it, but with an interpretive depth that revealed years of careful listening, of understanding music not through theory but through pure absorption. When he finished, there was complete silence. Jimmy lifted his hands from the keys and looked up at Professor Whitman. That the kind of understanding you meant? Whitman couldn't speak. He'd built his entire career on the assumption that musical understanding required formal training, that intuition without education was limited, that real sophistication was impossible without theoretical knowledge. And Jimi had just demonstrated a level of musical comprehension that most of Whitman's students, with all their training, would never achieve. A student in the back row started clapping, then stopped, unsure if applause was appropriate. The room remained suspended in that strange moment after something impossible has just occurred. Jimi stood up from the piano bench. "Thank you for letting me visit," he said quietly. "Hope the students learned something useful today." He walked toward the door, his movements unhurried, casual, as if he hadn't just shattered 15 years of academic certainty in 3 minutes. Dean Morrison followed quickly behind, shooting a concerned glance back at Professor Whitman, who remained standing motionless by the blackboard. The door closed. 50 students sat in complete silence, looking at their professor, waiting for some explanation, some way to process what they'd just witnessed. Whitman slowly walked back to his desk and sat down heavily in his chair. He removed his glasses and cleaned them with a handkerchief, though they weren't dirty. His hands were shaking slightly. "Class dismissed," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. The students filed out quietly, but they lingered in the hallway, talking in hushed tones about what they'd seen. Jenny Martinez would later say it was the moment she realized that musical knowledge and musical understanding weren't necessarily the same thing. Professor Whitman sat alone in his empty classroom for nearly an hour, staring at the blackboard where his careful diagrams of Bach's genius still remained. Everything he'd drawn was correct. Every analysis was accurate. Every theoretical point was valid. And none of it had prepared him for what he'd just heard. Over the following months, Professor Whitman's teaching began to change. He still emphasized the importance of music theory, still required his students to analyze harmonic progressions and study voice leading. But he also started talking about something he'd never mentioned before: the difference between knowing music and understanding music. He began assigning his students to listen to recordings without scores, to analyze music through their ears before their eyes, to trust their instincts as well as their training. Some of his colleagues questioned these new methods, but his students responded enthusiastically. Their playing became more musical, more expressive, more alive. In 1987, nearly 20 years later, Professor Whitman was interviewed for a documentary about innovative music education. The interviewer asked about the changes he'd made to his curriculum over the years. "I spent most of my career believing that formal training was the only path to musical understanding," Whitman said, his hair now completely gray, his face lined with age and experience. "I thought that without theory, without the ability to read music, a musician was fundamentally limited." "What changed your mind?" Whitman was quiet for a long moment. "I met someone who showed me that music exists beyond notation, beyond theory, beyond everything I thought I understood about how musical knowledge works. He played Bach better than I ever had, and he'd never seen the score." "Who was that?" "Jimi Hendrix. He visited my classroom once, and in 3 minutes he taught me more about music than I'd learned in 15 years of teaching." The interviewer looked surprised. "Jimi Hendrix played Bach?" "Perfectly, from memory, with more musical insight than most of my classically trained students ever achieved." That's when I realized that musical understanding isn't about reading notes on a page. It's about hearing the connections, feeling the relationships, understanding the conversations that happen between sounds. "Do you regret how you treated him that day?" Professor Whitman nodded slowly. "I was arrogant. I dismissed him before I'd even heard him play. I assumed that commercial success and musical sophistication couldn't coexist, that formal training was the only legitimate path to artistry. He showed me how wrong I was, and he did it with such grace, such quiet dignity." "Did you ever speak to him again?" "No. He died in 1970, 3 years after that visit. But I've thought about that day thousands of times since. He changed everything I believed about music education, about the relationship between knowledge and understanding, about the many different ways musical genius can manifest." The story of Jimi's visit to Berklee became legendary among music educators. Professor Whitman would tell it often in his later years, always emphasizing the lesson it had taught him about humility, about the limitations of academic prejudice, about the danger of confusing formal training with musical truth. The 50 students who witnessed it never forgot. Many of them became music teachers themselves, and they carried forward a more inclusive understanding of musical knowledge, one that valued both theoretical rigor and intuitive understanding. Jenny Martinez, who had sat in the third row that day, eventually became a professor herself. In her classes, she would often play recordings of both classical and popular music, asking her students to analyze them without knowing the genre or composer first. Music is music, she would tell them, echoing a lesson she'd learned 20 years earlier. Understanding it requires both your mind and your heart, both your training and your instincts. Never assume you know what someone understands just because they learned it differently than you did. The day Professor Whitman challenged Jimi Hendrix's musical legitimacy and watched Jimi respond with perfect Bach became more than just a story about two musicians. It became a lesson about the many forms musical genius can take, about the difference between knowing and understanding, about the importance of listening before judging. Jimi never spoke publicly about that day at Berklee, but those who knew him said he found it amusing rather than offensive, typical of the barriers he'd encountered throughout his career. He understood that musical prejudice usually came from fear rather than malice, from the anxiety of people who'd invested their identity in one particular way of understanding music. His response wasn't anger or defensiveness. It was simply music itself, played with such clarity and understanding that it dissolved arguments before they could form. That was his gift, not just the ability to play, but the ability to communicate through sound in ways that transcended every artificial boundary people tried to create around music. Professor Whitman learned that lesson the hard way, in front of 50 students on a March afternoon when his certainties crumbled in less time than it takes to play a Bach invention. And the music world became a little broader, a little more humble, a little more honest about the mysterious nature of musical understanding.